So the first thing I want to say about this is being in your own head can be a really dangerous place to be. So if you've been using substances for a while, it literally physically changes your brain. It changes the way that you think, it changes your executive functioning. And the crazy thing about it is that my thinking can get increasingly pessimistic and negative in order to give me an excuse to drink or use, which is a completely subconscious thing, right? But the problem is when I decide to stop drinking or using, well, my brain is still repeating that pattern because it wants me to do the same thing. Something that's pretty interesting is that the brain takes up about 3% of your body weight, but it consumes 20% of your energy. So it's what they call calorically ravenous. And because of this, the brain craves efficiency. It literally wants to do the same thing over and over. So if I've had this pattern of drinking and using, and I have this negative thinking downward spiral, my brain literally wants to continue that same pattern because it takes more energy to change those patterns. So now if I quit drinking and using, I really have to kind of combat this negative thinking and really rewire my brain to start being more positive and maybe even more realistic. It doesn't have to be sunshine and rainbows all the time, but it has to be, something where I'm living in reality, I'm challenging my thoughts, I'm not thinking in a destructive manner, because that's exactly what the substance abuse does. So the first thing I would say is just do something as simple as change your environment. Literally just getting outside, going to the store, going to a friend's house, anything like that, but just getting out of the place that you're in, because when you're kind of sitting in the same place, you're just kind of in this setting where your brain is allowing itself to depress. And so if I change my environment, that just kind of throws my brain a wrench a little bit. It just kind of changes things up, and so it can disrupt that pattern, that negative downward spiral thinking pattern. The next thing I would say is to change your company. And what I mean by this is even if you're alone, or if you're with people who are the most positive, or maybe they're not supportive of your recovery, or maybe it's a place where you're kind of tempted to drink or use, just change who you're with. So if you're alone, there's a saying that I heard early in recovery that really kind of applies to the being in your own head is a dangerous place. The saying was, an addict alone is in bad company. And I've really found that to be true. The times that I've struggled the most, if I just get around somebody else who's maybe in recovery too, or they're a positive person for me, they're part of my support network, then it's really going to help me change my negative thinking. The next thing I would say, tip number 2, is you can start your day over at any time. So I remember hearing this in a meeting, and it was like a revelation for me. Because for me, what would happen is I would get locked into this cycle of, if something bad happened to me, then I would kind of think, oh, today's just a bad fucking day. And I would kind of it would kind of become like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, I would expect bad things to happen, and therefore maybe I was kind of influencing bad things to happen to me. So I remember hearing that for the first time, you can start your day over at any time. I was like, holy shit, that's a really interesting thought. And I really found this to be true. And really kind of goes along with what I was just talking about. It's interrupting the pattern. So if I'm just getting into this negative thinking, if I'm thinking I'm having a bad day, maybe I start thinking about things that I'm grateful for, just to kind of interrupt that pattern. So one thing with this that's tied to this is that feelings aren't facts, okay? So what happens, the more that we use substances, the more the emotional part of our brain takes over and starts influencing our choices. So we start working less with the rational side of our brain and more with the emotional side of the brain. And this can really create this idea that the way that I'm feeling is the truth. So for example, if I'm feeling like, what's the point? If I feel maybe, like a fuck up, just down on myself, things like that, those feelings can feel immensely true in the moment. So these negative feelings that I'm telling myself, maybe I'm a piece of shit or something like that, they really can feel like the absolute truth. And I will tell you guys, even in recovery, I've had days where I was so depressed and down on myself and just feeling like nothing fucking mattered, nobody cares, all these kinds of things, where I was literally feeling suicidal. And then a few days later, when I kind of snapped out of it and things were okay again, I was like, what the fuck was I thinking? Why did that feel so real? The things that I was telling myself, it felt so real. But then a day, 2 days, 3 days later, I feel absolutely fine. It's a weird thing, but just understanding that feelings aren't facts can be really important. Another thing with this is understanding that we are an active participant in the way we feel. This was a hard thing for me to come to terms with. And I think a lot of people struggle with this. I think a lot of people think that the way they feel is something that just happens to them. They don't feel like they have any autonomy, any say in the matter. And the reality is, depending on your perspective, we really do have a choice in the way that we feel. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, grief and depression and these things aren't real, but I think that we underestimate the amount of power we have over feelings. Again, just like I was saying, just simply thinking about things that we're grateful for is a powerful force in changing the way that we feel. So don't just give in to the feelings, if that makes sense. Don't just run on autopilot. Like, try and be aware of the feelings. Don't necessarily fight the feelings. It's okay to feel the feeling, but you need to dissect it. Why am I feeling this way? Is this the truth? Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The next thing is connect to something bigger than you. Okay, so when I say this, a lot of times people think, oh, you're in recovery, you do 12-step recovery, you've got the whole God thing, whatever, higher power. I'm not necessarily saying that. When I say connect to something bigger than you, what I mean is it really kind of goes along the same lines of like being in your own head is a dangerous place to be. Just get connected to something outside of yourself. When I say something bigger than you, yeah, it could be spirituality, it could be God. It can also be family, friends, some kind of support group, a sports team, but just literally, any kind of group, just something bigger than yourself. So guys, we'll continue this video with a part 2. Thank you. Please like and subscribe and stay tuned for part 2.